We're moving on to the final phase of the day. We have Tom Lopez, Product Segment Head
We
and
did do slides.
SVP for Payment Products at M&T Bank. And again, we have Cheryl Gertz, RTP Product Manager from the Clearinghouse. And they are going to be talking about the Clearinghouse RTP Instant Payment Solution and expansion of capabilities.
Sit down, Wayne. Sit down.
Thank you. So I know we're in that weird time between lunch and happy hour on a Friday. If I can make a suggestion to Kinfos, you really have to have a bar or something. People will stay a little bit longer. Certainly, that would keep me here. So just a little side thing. I was very nervous about presenting in front of people again. It's the first time in 3 years, right? And I was really nervous about it. And then they sent me the presentation materials and it was 20 minutes. So I'm like, between me and Cheryl in a soapbox, we will be perfectly good to talk about this stuff.
Gonna have to get a thing to get us off.
All right. Okay. So before we get started, Cheryl mentioned, and I think Lee mentioned earlier, this is happy birthday time to the RTP network. This is 5 years, and it is kind of a milestone birthday. And I guess you say as far as the network is concerned, well, the first new payment channel in the United States in, is it 40 years? I think is the number that...
70s, in the 70s.
Right, since the 70s when the ACH was formed. So it is kind of cool. And it is a kind of a momentous time for RTP. And what I think we wanted to talk about, and some of these things have been covered a little bit today, so maybe we'll be done a little bit early. But we wanted to talk about, instead of, hey, this is what's going on in the network, these are the volumes, this is what you see happening today. We want to talk about what is on the roadmap for things to do future state. And some of these things you've seen, and we'll touch on each one of these things. I don't know if you can see this one over here. We'll touch on each one of these things very low detail. I think this is the kind of conference where we say, let's talk about it at a relatively high level, get in your mind as to what's coming. And then if you really want the detail, the clearinghouse.org has all kinds of materials where you can see all kinds of data about, record layouts, ISO messages, all that kind of fun stuff that we've been talking about today. So, we'll kind of keep it at the high level-y piece.
Tom, I just want to say one thing. We refer this as 2.0, right? We're 5 years old. So the foundation, RTP 1.0, if you would, the core transactions, we have volumes, everyone's sending credit transfers, it works. We don't even have to be there. System just works every day. So what 2.0 is, now that we've had our feet, we've figured out, operational readiness, we're doing overlay services, just like we have many of you out there that are designing overlay services on top of our plumbing. So we also at the Clearinghouse are doing a 2.0. We're already at the stage to start rolling out new products. So it's our 2.0 capabilities.
RTP 2.0.
2.0.
2.0. All right.
It's actually 2022, not 20.
Did you come here to heckle?
He asked you
Didn't I say to you outside, you're not allowed to say? I know where you live. You just told me. Nazareth, PA, wasn't it, my friend? So the first thing, again, touch on, right, is Zelle. And, everybody in the room has heard Lee talk about Zelle, right? And there was some good questions that actually came from you about why, right? And, there are some good reasons why to move Zelle through the RTP network. I think if you think practically, right, you have this instant payments mechanism that settles in the background through the ACH. And that is kind of counterintuitive. Now, if you're like me, a banker, and you're sitting there saying, okay, what's the benefit, right? Well, there is benefits to your back office, without a doubt, 100%. The way that settlement takes place behind the scenes, it has risk. There is counterparty risk to each institution that's involved in the transaction. And the clearinghouse deals with this stuff, I think, pretty smartly because it's done that before when it comes to transaction processing in general through the other payment rails like EPN and wire or chips. So there's experience there. But I think instinctively you think about, well, you have an instant payment mechanism. It really should settle instantly. And it would make your reconcilement, your next day reconcilement, your 2-day reconcilement, maybe a little bit easier. So, so think of it as an alignment. Now, this is to me, it's a long-term thing from a banking perspective because what you have today works, right? If you're doing Zelle and you have today, it works, right? But you should kind of talk to your back offices and see, hey, would it be nice if you're doing this thing with RTP, if you're doing RTP yet, and some of you aren't, and you're doing this thing with Zelle, can we marry these things together? So that's, maybe the word I'll use is standardization. And if you think about it, Zelle is a bank-to-bank network, right? It's owned by banks, right? So we really should be using the bank network, RTP, as a mechanism to settle. Now, my friends in the Fed will say, well, what about us? We'll get there too. I don't know if Cheryl, if you want to add anything to Zelle, but we move on. Now, this one's one of my favorites. So did anybody attend this conference last year, done virtually? Anybody? No. You did. Okay. So nobody saw my incredibly great Ken Burns-like documentary on RFP?
It was good.
Cheryl thought it was good. It was good.
Can I buy it, the reruns?
No, it's not publicly on YouTube because I got one of those nasty messages saying I was doing copyright infringement on music. So I had to put it behind the scenes, but it's pretty good, right? And I kind of made some predictions a year ago about RFP, and I did some cutesy stuff. And I made my son actually drive me to a cornfield, right? And I did the Field of Dreams thing where he films me walking through the cornfield and the voice is saying, if you build it, will they come, right? And I said the same thing for RFP. If you build it, will they come? And my answer was, not really, but it's a slow roll. And I think that's been right. I think with RFP in general, I think what we're seeing is hesitation by the industry for a lot of reasons, right? One is, and I'll kind of call this chicken and egg type of scenario, right? Well, you can't go to your corporate billers and say, hey, you want to do RFP bill payment? The clearinghouse has created a great prototype of screens for mobile apps. This is really, really cool stuff. It's kind of tough to go to them when there's nobody on the other end with the catcher's mitt catching the ball, right? And there really isn't that many banks that are ready to, not necessarily for the messaging, but for that consumer experience to actually take those transactions, and other folks have talked about it on the panels today, to take those transactions and put it into your digital experience to where the consumer knows exactly what that thing is for, and then they're like, yeah, pay, right? So that's a challenge. That's a challenge for the network in general. Now, what I will say about what the clearinghouse has done, though, is they've really put together a pretty cool, at least what they call reimagining of bill payment. I personally call it, maybe I'll steal the 2.0 thing, and I'll say bill presentment 2.0, because you really can marry a lot of data and give all that information back through that consumer banking experience, but you have to have both sides of the equation, right? So at M&T, I've only been in M&T a short period of time. I came through the People's United Bank acquisition, but I was with Citibank for 34 years. I developed RFP and RTP at Citi. And when I built that, there was no question about us doing it. We're just going to build RFP. And then, of course, nobody questioned, I was already out the door anyway, nobody questioned where there's the volume, right? I was God, right? So, yeah, at M&T, I'm being asked, hey, we got to get these message types up. So my natural question is, okay, what's going on the consumer side? And they say to me, why? I said, well, I'm not walking into senior treasury management officers who speak to customers to tell them to sell a product that can't reach my own M&T customers. That's a challenge that I think we have in the network. Okay, and that's a challenge that I think we're all going to wrestle with. If you haven't wrestled with it yet, you will. Now, the other thing I'm going to say about this, the bill pay process is, if you haven't figured it out already, I'm a little bit of a wise guy. So I left Citi, I moved to Peoples, and then I heard about this really cool pilot that was going on with Citi and Verizon and Bank of New York. And I was like, gee, I'm a Verizon customer. I'm a Citi customer. I want in. And my Citi colleagues were ghosting me. But, you know, I mean, I was good friends with these people. And then suddenly they're like, oh, you know, he's competition. So I called the clearinghouse. I said, hey, guys, I want to be part of the pilot. And they got me in. The pilot worked very, very well. There were definitely, if you call it an MVP, minimally viable product, I think it was fantastic. It worked really well. The screens that Citibank designed on the consumer experience were excellent. Really good flow. You know, everything worked well. And I'm talking about opt-in, opt-out. You know, it's not just a question of sending the request for payment. You have to opt into the biller. You know, there's a whole process involved where you have to have the ability for a consumer bank to tell the to allow the customer to decide, yeah, I want to see these bills. No, I don't want to see these bills. And that whole flow has to work, right? And it worked very, very well. There were some things that if you looked at it as a true product, I would say it didn't work as well. For example, I'm thinking end-to-end, close the loop, right? So I expect as soon as I hit that pay, 20 seconds later, I go on Verizon's website and my bill is paid. Still batch process. And some other folks were talking about that as well as a challenge that we have in the industry, right? Because, you know, we have this instant payments mechanism and we're talking about using it for bill pay, but the biller side, that merchant side, not necessarily quite as far along. So there were things like that, you know, I pointed out. They're probably like, why the hell the clearinghouse let this jerk in? It's a pain in the neck. But I think it gave some really good information. I told them some screen design things that I think from a flow standpoint would have been better. But overall, it worked very well. So the mechanism is there. But again, you now need to make it sellable commercialization-wise. You really have to have banks receiving them to be able to create that consumer experience. And that's the challenge, right? And that's the challenge I think that we're going to be dealing with for the foreseeable future.
And Tom, I think what everything's showing is network effect, right? You need network effect to get all the banks on first. You need network effect in order to design products. You know, we have, one of the things that was interesting to me and a metric is that many, on the consumer side, even though there's quite a few banks that are enabled, not just Citi, but there's probably the top 6 banks now are enabled to receive on the consumer side, came back and said 40% of their customers only have digital devices. So you can have the acceptance by the bank, by Citibank, but I'm Verizon, I might only be able to reach 40% because even though all of us carry these all along all the way, especially when you start going down to the community banks and the credit unions, many people do not use mobile apps. And if you don't have the mobile app, most of these products are being built on that digital experience on the mobile app. So network effect, behavioral changes. Again, this will be a rollout for early adopters. There's specific places it will be used, but don't expect a full industry-wide reach, you know, for 5 or 10 years.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think it's going to take time. You know, at Citi, we developed the screens on the digital online banking platform. And mobile, it was like, well, it's going to be a lot of money to do mobile, and, you know, we're going to do it this much, and we're going to see. And I think they made the right decision because, you know, I'll talk about this maybe later. As prioritization is always a challenge. I think all of us have to deal with project prioritization and what do you do first? What do you do next? Now, I wanted to talk about this one a little bit in relation to the whole bill payment piece, because I think it is something that's kind of cool that's coming down the pike also is document exchange. So I'm not going to get into the nits and nats of APIs and, how a tokenized transaction can send an API and you can drop a PDF and you can pull a PDF. Don't even ask me the question. If you do, I'll point at Cheryl or we'll drag Lee back into the room, right? But again, it's basically taking that RTP experience and say from an RFP standpoint, sending that quote unquote bill through a request for payment, but adding in data that allows an API to be executed so that a digital image, a PDF of a bill could actually physically be put into that message. And then when the customer gets it in their digital banking experience, they just click that and they get, boom, through an API, they get the invoice. Now, bill presentment, kind of like bill presentment, maybe a little bit better experience because of the way that it flows through the network. And, of course, on that screen, like your typical RFP process, you have options. Do I pay? Do I pay partial? Do I reject? Do I reject and tell the sender, I don't even want to get a transaction through this mechanism again? That's where you start getting into nuance and probably why, as Cheryl said, this is kind of a long-term play because there's questions about warranties. There's questions about what you put on those screens. There's all kind, even like, let's face it, with the United States, there's all kinds of state things that, you have to do certain things in California that you can't do in other states. So I just say that none of these issues by themselves are insurmountable, but, they add to the timeline, and they certainly add to the timeline of adoption.
Another
Okay.
thing is, just so everyone knows, brand, right? Clearinghouse is a network operator, a utility. We've never had a brand. So it's interesting when new competitors come into the market, such as FedNow and other, if they decide, what's an RFP? Is it the clearinghouse's RFP? Each bank will have their own look and feel. We try to give guidelines, but we know that most banks, even when you go to your online banking, they look different. So how will you also deal with brand of what's an RFP? Will we even be using that term? Will another bank brand it somewhere else? Who can you reach? So the brand awareness is becoming a very big part of the discussion too, as you go to roll out industry-wide changes to long-term known processes that the banks deliver.
Yeah, I will say what I compliment the clearinghouse on was they came up with basically prototypes of screens or of mobile device, but you could also
Wire shots.
correct and
Wireframes.
wireframes, right? Thank you. Okay, I'm not that savvy, right? So they came up with these really good flows and screens, and at Citi we took that and we said, okay, we're good at client experience. The core of what they had, we preserved, and then we just added our spin to it within our Citibank Online, Citi Business online platforms. And if you looked at the prototypes and looked at ours, all the information was exactly there perfectly. So the clearinghouse laid it out. This is how it should look. And hopefully everybody does that so that there's uniformity, because certainly the data has to be uniform. What you present to the customer has to be uniform. This is a value add. When you get into adding the actual physical invoice, now you got something like really cool that I think does enhance the online banking experience. But again, long play. I think several years away. I think you'll see pilots going on. You'll hear more about this. I would say even like a Verizon might jump on and do a pilot with the actual physical invoice. Right? But again, these are kind of long-term plays.
And just one other point, it's not just consumer bill pay. I mean, everyone's using this use case as communication. It's also made for B2B. You're a small business and you want to go and you're a beer distributor and you're going to a bar to drop off 4 cases of beer and they don't want to pay by credit card, payment on demand. You can request as you're sitting there or RFP to the bar. You have a copy of the invoice right there. They can just click pay now. So we see also, and we're starting to have some business-to-business funding of payroll, especially in the banking industry where small businesses have to fund their payroll 2 to 3 days before the payroll goes out. We're using there's use case on the network today, they're using RFPs to fund it an hour before they send the payrolls out. So yes, in the industry, all I ever see is bill pay and Verizon. It's much broader than that. And I think the business applications will be quicker to get out regionally than you're going to see some of the nationwide consumer applications.
So here's another one that was talked about a little bit earlier when I think probably the first panel that was on talked about 4-minute warning. It's annoying, isn't it?
Well, let me give you an update where IXB is. So, of course, we've conquered the U.S. domestic market, and now we're looking forward to cross-border because everyone that doesn't want to do domestic seems to want to do cross-border. So what the Clearinghouse did a couple months ago is we actually teamed up with the EBA and with SWIFT, and I think it was last year in the SIBOS meeting, a proof of concept was completed. We moved a message from the PAX 08 from the U.S. Clearinghouse over to EBA and back. Now, that was a technology proof of concept, and I can tell you guys that the technology of moving an ISO message from one place to another was probably the easiest part of the pilot. So we do know that we can move across borders and move a message between, which we should in an ISO, interoperability and whatever. So that was successful. We are now in the second phase, which is working on an MVP. We have a limited number of banks. I think it's about 3 banks over in Europe, a couple banks here. And we are working now on actually moving with the FX and doing an atomic settlement. That's the hard part. And FX conversion. We are, I think, targeting now first or second quarter for that limited, very limited pilot of banks to move to get the FX right and to make sure the settlement happens. There's a lot of things that have to be adjusted on some of the ISO messages that are for domestic. You have additional fields. You have some other things you have to keep track of. You got time differences. So those are all being worked on from a technical. Where the rubber hits the road is rules, and with putting the rules and the governance together. So we're concurrently working on that with the team, and there'll be new operating rules, and there'll be, we're expecting that an MVP 2 after the first one mid-year will come out and will expand the number of banks. So again, long-term, this is not going to be happening to you down the street, your bank down the street, unless it's one of the 2 major FX banks in the U.S., will not be happening until 2024. But it takes that long, right, to have an idea, to look visionary, and to find the way to, again, figure the technology, which to us seems to be the easiest side, trying to get many banks to agree on compliance and operating rules and chart, what do you do if there's errors is what takes the time. And so we're very excited about it. I know a lot of people think they're going to start sending payments to Europe tomorrow. I doubt it, but they try.
I think we as payments people, all of us in the room that are involved in payments, we get things all the time, especially in the last, probably since a little bit before same day ACH, this perception that things are happening very, very slowly. And if you go back cross-border, right? So I'm an old ACH guy. Do you remember CBR, PBR? How long did it take for us to actually have cross-border payments in the ACH space? It was a long time, right? And then it took a long time to go from just Canada and Mexico into SEPA, different currencies, right? So, I feel like this is moving the way it should be moving. I think everybody has the perception, outside of people that are involved in the industry like we are, that it's moving slow because technology is very quick now. Now we talk about APIs and we talk about all kinds of digitization, all the buzzwords, right? Mm-hmm. Digitization, radical digitalization, right? Everything is about instantaneous, but there's still stuff you got to do to actually make these things work, both, FX rules are probably the biggest barrier, right? Every country has their rules, right? And you have to comply, and there's going to be nuance to all of these different regions. So I kind of feel good that I really actually I feel like it's moving. And again, like all these things we're talking about here, they're not short-term things, but it's cool that we're working on them.
And it's built as a plug and play. So Europe is first, but there's already discussions with some of the other, NPP and
Yeah.
all
Last
the other
thing,
ones. So they would just plug in. So you're not starting another pilot. You would add in the next corridor.
last thing, and we're just going to brush on this, is something that probably everybody has heard about all the time, right? Tokenizations of accounts, right? And it's a concept that's out there. My bank is involved, right? And I can tell you, I don't think there's any real clients doing anything with it, because if I put this ain't it. This ain't the flow, okay? It's fairly complicated, but the idea is, let's make it analogous to UPIC, right? In the ACH world, where you can tokenize a masking account, right? A real account. And this isn't just for RTP, although it's a natural fit for RTP. It also has coverage into the ACH world through EPN. You're going to be hearing more about this. I think it's, again, it's going to be about doing a pilot, testing out how the rails actually work. The
technology is there now for banks to do only sender account tokenization on the RTP system.
We're a minute or so over. Is there any questions?
No, we got the hook.
You got a question? What's your quick question?
So, thinking about it from a bank perspective, as a bank, what challenges do you see for us with RTP in the coming years?
Yeah, that's a tough question. That's a good question. So,
One word,
in
prioritization.
my opinion, the biggest challenge that we have, if you think about, you have a prioritization list in your bank. I mean, we talked a little bit earlier. That has nothing to do with RTP. You got probably a laundry list of stuff that you got to do, and then you add in RTP, and you're like, okay, RTP, origination, receive. What about FedNow? What about ISO 20022 for wires? So to me, all of these cool things, it's not a question of will and should we do these things? It's a question of bandwidth. You're not going to be able to do all these things, and you really got to pick and choose your spots. And you got to pick and choose your spots based on what your bank wants to do,
And your
based
customer-
upon what the network is doing and what the
your
volume
customer
is.
base.
So with that, I apologize. We went over. I put the conference behind. I thought I was going to go short too, because I'm a short guy. Thank you all very, very much.